Good afternoon and welcome to a conversation with Walt and Bob Wick, co-chairman of Wick Communications Company. We're in the Marquette Hotel in downtown Minneapolis attending the Wick Publishers Conference. My name is Tom Lee. I work for Wick Communications Company, as do many of the people in the audience today. We're fortunate to have several members of the Wick family with us, and Walt and Bob, thank you so much for joining us and spending the day with us.
Well, thank you, and it's good to be here.
Great pleasure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm going to read through a biographical summary, and then your first question is going to be about your dad, Milt, and your Uncle James. And we're going to have several pictures that Rebecca's already prepared for us. People who know the Wick brothers say that Walt is the head and Bob is the heart. The two of them together prove that 1 + 1 = 3. Together, they worked with Lou Major Sr., CEO, to run the company. Walt was based in Scottsdale, Bob in Sierra Vista, and Lou in Bogalusa. And when Lou Major retired in 2001, John Matthew joined the company as president and CEO, and that allowed Walt and Bob to step back from their daily involvement. The company was founded by their father, Milton I. Wick, and his brother James. In 1926, Milton and James bought their first newspaper with proceeds from a book business they'd started. Milton and James acquired the Niles Daily Times in Niles, Ohio, and continued from there, building the business and adding newspapers to their company. In 1964, James Wick died, and Walt and Bob purchased his interest. At that time, the company had 15 to 20 newspapers. Today, the company has 23 specialty publications and 32 community newspapers in 13 states. Walt and Bob started working at the Niles Daily Times when they were very young. Walt sold magazines when he was 10 and peddled newspapers from age 12 to 15. Later, he worked in the ad department and the sports departments and covered the police beat during the summers when school was not in session. Younger brother Bob swept floors, hawked newspapers, and covered sports in the police beat. During newspaper breaks in college, he worked in the circulation department. Both brothers attended Kent State University, concentrating on journalism. After Walt attended 1 year there on a scholarship, he went on to the University of Minnesota and studied there, studying history, literature, and the languages. By this time, Milton Wick's health had started to fail. Before completing his studies, Walt joined the family business in Niles with his father and uncle. Milton later settled in Phoenix, and Walt moved first to Sierra Vista, then to Scottsdale to keep closer tabs on the health of his father. Milt Wick died in 1981 at the age of 82. Bob made a career change during his junior year at Kent State. He discovered he had a talent for visual creativity. That led him to attend Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, where he earned his master's degree in sculpture. He returned to Kent State in 1962, this time as an instructor of sculpture and drawing. Bob eventually developed a transcontinental lifestyle, teaching sculpture and drawing at State University of New York and Fredonia part of the year, and spending the other half in Arizona helping out in the family business. Each brother married and raised children, and it hasn't always been easy. Bob's first wife passed away in 1970, leaving him with 3 young children to raise alone for a 10-year period. And sadly, both Walt and Bob each lost a son to separate car accidents on the same day, 7 years apart. Today, Walt is 77 years old and alternates spending time in Scottsdale and in Ohio. Am I still working here? He is a voracious reader. Bob is now 73 and spends time in his sculpture studio where he produces large-scale bronze statues which incorporate living plants. His artwork has been featured at showings in cities across the country. Their children either have been or are involved with the company at various levels. 4 of the children serve on the Wick Board of Directors. In September 2004, the whole family gathered in Phoenix to see Walt and Bob inducted into the Arizona Newspaper Hall of Fame, an honor that had also been bestowed posthumously upon their father years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, Walt and Bob Wick. I'd like to get into these first questions, and the one that most intrigues us is about your father and how he started, what made a light go off when James and Milton Wick said, let's start a newspaper.
You just wanted to...
Did it just happen that way?
Well, no. My Uncle Jim came out of the University of Minnesota, and Bob can tell you some stories about my Uncle Jim relative to the University of Minnesota. But he was working for a newspaper in Stoughton, Wisconsin, where there were a lot of other fellow Norwegians. And he got the idea he wanted to be a newspaper publisher. So he heard about this newspaper in Niles, Ohio, that had gone bankrupt 3 times and were attempting to sell off the assets for some money. So he put together a bunch of his buddies in college who had been selling books together to get through college. They went both to the University of Minnesota, University of Nebraska, and the University of Iowa. My father went to all 3 universities, and he sold books in the summers during his years in college in order to be able to afford the next year in college. And he rode across Saskatchewan and Manitoba on a bicycle, selling 2 volumes in a set. One volume was on the husbandry for the average rancher, and the second one was a history of the Great War. And he would go from one farmhouse to the next on this bicycle. And he said, I don't know if any of you know how far the farmhouses are apart in North Dakota. You can understand what they're like in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You know, there are 3 grain elevator towns and 1 grain elevator towns, and that's how big the towns are. But anyway, he went from one farmhouse to the next, and he would sell these books, and he would say from one farmhouse, you know Sam Jones, who lives down the lane there, how he lost this calf? Well, it cost him far more than this set of books would have cost if he had only had it to treat that calf. And so he sold the set of books to him, and they would be mailed to them later on. The second year, he did the same thing, only further up the northern scale of the Canadian prairie. But that's how they got started in the book business, getting themselves through college. And the picture you saw there of my father, the one with him sitting at the desk, I want you to know that that was the same roll-top desk that I put my brother under when I rolled the top down that blocked. And I got kind of panicky about the situation because I thought he would probably suffocate, you know, which, of course, being an older brother didn't bother me that much, but Dad got excited about these sort of things. And Dad came around, it was a Sunday morning, you know, one of those deals when everybody else was in church. Dad was working, and we'd come down to the newspaper with him, and that's how he got locked in the desk. So.
I always paid the price.
The actual Niles Times, like I say, was purchased in 1926 for $6,750. I once said to him, I heard that it was, to my dad, $7,500, Dad. He says, no, it was $6,750. And that's what they started out with. As my dad told me one time, he says, you know, we were too young to know better. We were still essentially just released college students. And they had all this energy. We're talking about my dad. We're talking about Jim Wick. His name was Lester James Wick. And of course, at that stage in American history in the 1920s, Lester was a no name. That was a bad name. All the cartoon kids in the strips that got the heck kicked out of them were named Lester. So my uncle switched it and made James L. Wick was the name he went by for the rest of his life. Anyway, they got started, and they had 3 other buddies from college, Ray Kochen, Roy Forsman, and Jerry Joachim. And these 5 guys put all this energy into the Niles Daily Times, and they bought the Girard News, and they created Summons Struthers, which is in Youngstown, Ohio, and that general metropolitan area. And by the time the Depression hit, why, they were a real going activity. They were making money, they were having fun, they were involved with the town, the community, and Gosh, there's a slew of stories, but I'll turn it over to my brother here a bit here. You ask him.
Bob, could you talk about how your father and your uncle, what made them different from each other, and did they have similar traits?
Well, I think, for one thing, my uncle was more intellectual. He was a very, very learned person, had been highly educated, and not that my father hadn't too, but he was a person who was really a scholar type in many respects. And his skill was writing. He was really a wonderful writer. It came very natural to him, and that was something he wanted to explore with his life. My father was this great salesperson, and my father was a doer. He was a man of action, a man of. As a young man, he was a wonderful hockey player. Even though he weighed 110 pounds, he was the goalie and used to get blasted by much bigger people. He was a courageous person. He didn't fear about his size. But he was also a marvelous diver. He won many awards in diving and gymnastics, and he was extremely fast runner. I believe he was second best in the state of Minnesota, I think, in 100-yard dash in high school. So he was a very talented person physically, but he also had this phenomenally charming personality, and he knew how to sell. And in fact, I think one of the things that's quite remarkable, if I remember right, I had heard that my father was making as much as $10,000 a year in 1918, or approximately that time, selling books. And so that it gives an indication, if you try to go back to how much money that would have been in our time, it was a quite phenomenal amount of money. And that was one of the ways in which he could accumulate money for putting together, and buying the first paper. But he was a man of daring and vigor and tremendous energy. My father, when my brother and I were growing up, my father was up and gone to work before we ever got up for school. I literally never saw my father in the morning. He had already gone to work. He came home for dinner, and he would eat dinner at home, and then he would go back to work in the evenings. So that was literally 5 days a week. He worked all day Saturday usually too, and then sometimes on Sunday. I mean, it was his passion. He had this tremendous desire and drive, and phenomenal skill at working with people. My Uncle Jim in college was at one time head of the university newspaper, and that was approximately the time of World War, just before they were going into World War I. In an editorial in the paper, he opposed going into World War I, and that created quite an uproar on the campus, and also among the administration too, that he expressed this very openly. Well, the result, unfortunately, was that because he was such an outstanding student, he was expected to get a Phi Beta Kappa. They did not give it to him on the basis of that editorial. In other words, there were so many people upset by it, they wouldn't give it to him. And that was a disappointment, actually, for my Uncle Jim's years in his early part of his life, that he never got that, because he really deserved it. The interesting part about that was, when the war came, he was one of the first ones to volunteer, put on a uniform and go to war. Now, he did not go to the front lines, but he was in the military during World War I. So it also shows the character he had in defending his own country, too.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask the two of you, when you, little boys acting up, how did your father get after you when the two of you, if you weren't behaving, what did he do?
You have to understand this.
Or did you behave?
Mother was a disciplinarian in the family. And Dad only, in my entire life, and especially in boyhood, only struck me once. And that was kind of unusual. I must have been 13 or 14. I was walking by him and I was whistling in the house. And he said, "Walter, I would appreciate it if you'd not whistle. It hurts the ears." And I said, "Oh, okay, Dad." And so I went on and started whistling again. You know, that's when you're happy, you're feeling good and all that sort of jazz. And he said, Walter, my goodness, he said, please, it's hard on my ears. So I said, oh, geez, okay, Dad. Well, I went back by his chair and I was whistling again. And Dad turned to me and went, I'd never been hit by my father before. It didn't hurt. It was the only action I'd ever seen him take. He actually physically touched me while admonishing me at the same time. But he was one of these fellows. I mean, when my mother caught me smoking cigarettes and buying them at the local Kmart or wherever the hell it was, pardon me, at that time, why, she said, this is too much. You know, I can't fathom disciplining you under these circumstances. You're going to have to speak to your father. And that was the ultimate terror in my life, that she was going to tell Dad about the things I did. And when she would tell him that, why, Dad would begin talking to me. And the way he handled these problems was, Walter, remember, your mother suffers greatly from taking care of me, your younger brother, yourself, and her mother. Think of the burden she carries. So I want you to think when you do these things about her. It was always about my mother. And he said, you know, you've got to care for her and take care of her so that she doesn't have to carry these burdens without support. And you could feel yourself shrinking. I remember standing in front of the window, just shrinking as he told me these things. And of course it happened several times. But that was always the approach he had. Take care of your mom. She carries these burdens so heavy, especially the boys in the family, you know.
Tell us a little bit about your experience as paper boys in the snow. I mean, it sounds like some times were different then, and big brother helped little brother, or was it the other way around?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think my brother actually started pedaling before I did. I think he said it was in the summer of, or the spring of, wait, 49? No.
43.
43.
Yeah.
And so Walter, we had a route that, I was trying to remember, how many customers did we have?
No, we only had about 50 customers when we started.
But we ended up, I knew we were in the 80s when we got through. And it was always the same number of buildings.
Number of streets, yeah.
Number of streets and stuff like that. But, so my brother started, and then by the fall, I started helping him pedal. And we would split. He took us maybe a slight bit more. I had the little smaller section. He took the larger section. And our grandmother and mother, and primarily our grandmother, would fold the papers for us. And then we would come home from school and we'd grab our roots and we'd run around and throw the papers. And we also, it was interesting when Walt said that, I remember when I started collecting, when we had to collect, the paper was 18 cents a week. And Walt said it had just come 18 cents from 15 cents. So, and he said that we would keep 3 cents a paper. That's how much we were. Yeah, but Walt didn't tell me that. He only told me he kept 1 cent. Yeah, so guess what happened to me?
Skimming.
Anyway, on Saturdays, we'd collect. We decided that we wanted to collect on Friday night because we wanted to have Saturdays more for ourselves. And although we would sometimes collect some on Saturday, we actually gave us much more time, so we didn't have to use up so much of Saturday collecting and that. But actually, the big snowstorm that came, Walt wasn't there. I had to do the. It was Thanksgiving of 1949, and Walt was away, and they had about 25 inches of snow. And so I trudged through snow, and it was interesting. We were the only newspaper in the valley that put out a paper. The Warren Tribune did not put out a paper, and the Youngstown Vindicator did not put out a paper at that time. Niles Times was the only paper. And so, you know, it took me about, what ordinarily would have taken an hour to do, it took like 4 to 6 hours to pedal the paper just to get through snow. Because it was up to here on me, literally, going through this.
That says something about newspapers. The good newspapers understand that you get a newspaper out every edition, regardless of the weather.
Absolutely.
What was going on in the newspaper? Was it your father, or who set your newspaper apart from the other two that failed to publish because of the snow?
Well,
I mean, you could have easily just said, we're not going to publish.
Well, I think the camaraderie of the people were putting out the newspaper.
Absolutely.
I mean, I knew Freddie Belcastro and Nick Zuzolo, and I grew up in the composing room of the newspaper. I mean, even though it was unionized, these were all family friends. You know what I mean? A fellow by the name of Beansy Wick was the foreman, and he wasn't even related. But it was that kind of, they were just expected. They probably undoubtedly all walked to get to the newspaper because that was their job. And, you know, it's like today, you get an inch of snow in certain areas of the United States, and they close all the schools and turn down the blinds and the businesses and all this sort of stuff. But no, it was not expected. It snowed all the time. It was just the fact that it was 25 inches just happened to be slightly different, you know. And, but that was the reason. What
did your father and your uncle do to retain what did they do to keep their good people? How did they keep people from leaving?
Well, I remember this. I never forgot it. I was just I was probably 14 or 15 at the time, but I was working in the paper. And the paper really, with the exception of the print area, which was downstairs in the press, was really one large room. It was just a huge room. It was Knights of Columbus, was that the building?
Knights of Pythias.
Knights of Pythias had been a building, and formerly the building that was Dad had and purchased for the newspaper had been a Knights of Pythias building. So it had been a giant club, and it was actually kind of what you call Gothic in character and that. But it had this one enormous room where everyone was in there. And I remember seeing my father come in one morning, and I just watched him, and he literally went around to every person in that room. There was probably 12 to 15 people at least, maybe 20. And he talked to everyone personally. And he would talk to them about how they're doing and what's happening and that sort of thing. And he just took the time to go around to every person. And when I saw that, I think the thing that really touched me was, here's a man who has a passion, not only for what he does, but for the people that work for him. And he really was like that all the time. And I know that there were times when, during the Depression, my father got up before anyone else was there because he had to cut costs, because he swept the floors. He swept the floors before anyone came in. And but he really had a wonderful relationship with virtually everyone there. And that was, I think, a distinct character of him, and a way in which he kept these people, and they wanted to work with him because they knew he was fair, decent, and a person who cared.
Some of the ones he had to let go during the Depression, I know he got on the phone and tried to find them jobs himself. Stanley Hart, who ran the Warren Tribune later as a newsman and who was one of the best newsmen in the whole valley, was one of the fellows that Dad had to let go at that time. And he was Dad's friend throughout his life. The guys would come back from other jobs and stuff like that and say, well, geez, Milton, it's not like working for the Times. And but things were so bad that they even wrote out script. I don't know if any of you know what script was, but in the bad times, why the newspapers and the local merchants would get together and make scripts so that you could exchange it for the products that they had that you didn't have enough money to buy with. And so it was that kind of circumstance. And I remember Dad saying to me that, you know, that there was never a year that they didn't make money. But he said one year it was only $15. And I have a sneaking suspicion that he juggled the books to get it to say $15.
We wouldn't do that today.
No juggling the books. No. Yeah, the commission on $15 wasn't high.
I wanted to ask you about during the Depression, when times were toughest, and your dad would come home from work, did he ever vent any to you guys, or did he keep it all to himself? Did he say, boy, you have no idea how rough it is out there? Or was it years later that you learned?
He loved the job so much. He never thought of it in those terms. I never heard him complaining about that type of thing. Dad was a jokester. He loved the joke. I mean, kind joke. He wasn't. None of his jokes were mean. But you know, he was the type of guy that well, to give you an example, after he'd had his heart attack and had been off work essentially for quite a while, he was away on a trip, and I was at the office kind of just making do for things while he was gone, and I got this letter from the Ohio Newspaper Association, and it said, "Dear Milt, we're really happy that you could attend our annual conference this time since you missed the last couple ones because of your illness. It was tremendous the way you reproduced the camaraderie that you used to engender in our organization. We surely hope to see you again soon. P.S. Enclosed is a bill for the bass drum that you broke while entertaining the rest of the group." You get a little idea what Dad was like. So.
There was a period in Niles where there was a criminal element in town.
Well,
And
yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know any town that doesn't have at least a minimum criminal,
but the newspaper played a role.
Yeah, it did. They bought it during the middle of the, quote, roaring 20s, and bootleg operations were going like mad. And Uncle Jim, who was a fearless writer, was writing things about the Black Hand. Now, the Black Hand was the original sort of designation for racketeering and particularly the mafia kind of groups that got together in the industrial towns where so many of the immigrants settled in order to get jobs. And so he engendered a lot of opposition on the part of the racketeers. They would get upset. Well, two of the ones that kind of thugs in the town were brothers by the name of Marty and Frankie Flask. Now, I'm assuming that both of them are dead at this time, but anyway, they were thugs dressed just the way you imagined to be, like out of The Godfather. And one of them, Frankie, drove a Stutz Bearcat. And anyway, my Uncle Jim, you have to understand, Uncle Jim was a lot like. I don't know if you've ever seen Sean Connery in the Indiana Jones deal when he played the father of Indiana Jones. Anyway, in other words, when the roof would be falling in, he'd still be studying some inscription on the wall, And Jim was like that. So Jim was crossing the street, and gosh knows where he was looking. And anyway, Frankie Flask gunned his Stutz Bearcat and tried to run my uncle down. He even turned the corner after him, and trying to run him up on the, and Uncle Jim got behind a light post and escaped the problem. But he was so upset that he wrote this column all about how Frankie had tried to run him down. And the big boss in Niles at that time, which is a town of 18,000, so you're not talking about a huge town, it was a fellow by the name of Sonny Jim Jennings. And Sonny Jim got so upset with Frankie for trying that he came to my uncle and apologized to him. Because at that time, Sonny Jim didn't want any more trouble than he already had. And that was the period of time when a very courageous newspaper man out of Canton, Ohio, the Canton Repository, was blatantly killed by a mob-hired gun. And it just tore the hell out of the mob throughout most of the Midwest, because at that time, even the governor had to act on what was happening in the state. So the guys really didn't want any trouble. But it was fascinating what went on in the give and take in a small town with the kind of racketeering element. One of the most fascinating things about it was that Sonny Jim, after a fellow by the name of Harvey Kistler was elected mayor on sort of a reform ticket. And they had a mayoral system where the mayor was the power behind what was going on. I mean, he truly was, he wasn't just some guy picked out of the council to be named mayor. Anyway, Harvey would go down to the police station and he would grab 2 or 3 guys at night and he'd say, "Come with me." And he would go out and he'd hit one of the bootleg joints. And speakeasies, as they called them. And he kept doing this, and they'd have to close it up, and all this stuff. First of all, you have to remember that almost every one of these policemen was getting a little bit of cash on the side from Sonny Jim and his operations. And it was just, that was the way it was. But they couldn't do anything if the mayor said, come and you have to do this and arrest these guys, because the mayor was the power, just like the president is the supreme commander of the army. And so Sonny Jim Jennings got really upset about what was going on with his speakeasies. And he accused the police of not doing their job when they had been well provided for. And so one day, he and a couple of his pug uglies came walking right through the fire department, which was attached to the police department, and through the fire department into the police department, and he demanded to know why they were not operating according to the amount of money that he was paying them to defend his interests in this town. He actually signed a brief against them, a legal brief, charging them with taking bribes. And this was the biggest trial the county had ever seen. There was Sonny Jim on the stand telling who he had paid and why he had paid them. And the jury listened to this, and they listened to the defense. And not one of those policemen was convicted. However, because Sonny Jim had signed the fact that he had attempted to bribe a public official and had actually admitted to paying out money, he was convicted of bribing a public official, and he went to jail for 2 years for it, state prison.
Good.
He came back a wiser man.
I think so. When you, both of you, as you started getting more involved in the company, would you talk about those years, what you were doing? I mean, beyond the paperboy period, getting into really working at the papers, when you got into Arizona, I know, Walt, you worked in the press room for a while, and you saw occasion where a press motor broke down once, and somebody had to get it rigged up.
No, you're talking about one of my best friends, Nick Hager. Some of you may have heard of him, and I'm sure some of you know him. Yeah, Nick, we had this old press, the old Hoe press up in Williston is where it was, and the electrical system went kaputsk. So Nick said, well, I can fix it at least temporarily. And he rigged it so that it was, the lines were fed directly, the electrical was fed directly to the press, skipping the entire battery of electrical connections that most presses have, so you can reg it up at a certain time. And then he inserted the gear shift section from a international pickup, and so that he could gauge the amount of speed that the thing was going, and he would shift this thing here so it would go from first to second to third and so forth. And we ran that way a long time because we tried to get something from the Hoe company, and they said the last press electrical unit system on that was just being shipped to Japan for scrap. And so until we used that for 2 or 3 years before we went offset, we went and bought an offset press.
It worked for 2 years?
Well, we were always afraid that some idiot was going to shove it into reverse. But it worked. He made it work. He was a mechanical genius.
Good grief. That's a great
He came around and worked on a number of the papers throughout the system here. Nick Hager, yeah.
Getting into more current years, both of you have been involved for several years and through the 80s and in the 90s in our newspapers. I know one area that is near and dear to Bob's heart is the environment. And if you give me just a moment here, I wanted to share with you and everybody else just an example of Bob's involvement in the environment. And this came from Manuel Coppola. There you are. A couple years ago, Bob and Rosie went down to Nogales. There'd been some water pollution problems. And Bob had heard about it, and there's going to be a town hall meeting. I'd like to read to you what Manuel wrote about your visit down there and what it meant to him and what it meant to the community. More than 100 people showed up and stayed for about 3 hours, even though the air conditioning system was broken and it was almost 90 degrees in the hall. Bob and Rosie stuck it out. Bob stood before the crowd and pledged our company's continued support. He encouraged the community to find long-lasting solutions to the pollution problem. And soon after, things started falling into place. The state of Arizona temporarily took over the water company and hired a firm to manage it until the problems could be fixed. In all of this, Bob helped me understand a community newspaper's responsibility to reach out to its readership. Bob, how did environmental issues become a core part of your life?
Well, just before I want to say, I do want to say I really appreciate what Manuel has done. And because it's really his commitment has carried this all out. I mean, Rosie and I were there and that, but we were really minor characters in this whole thing. It's really been Manuel and his efforts that have really made progress and moved that whole thing. And I thank him for that too. I suppose that I think that I've always had an intense love of nature. And I suspect that being very cognizant of that and having a really powerful effect on me and wanting to preserve it really for future generations. Having seen certainly some really sad areas, and Douglas was certainly one of them at one time. Back in the early 80s, we really had a terrible problem in Douglas, and where there were some hearings that actually were in Cananea, and some of our governmental officials were there. And the thing that was worrying everyone was the fact that Cananea, which had a mining process and also smelter, was planning to enlarge. And Douglas, of course, was already fully operational, and then there was going to be a new smelter going in Nacazari, Mexico, which is about 100 miles or 75 miles south of the border. And I don't know if any of you remember Sierra Vista, but there could be times when the Douglas smelter was so bad that you could be in downtown Sierra Vista and you could not see the Huachuca Mountains. It was dependent upon the wind, the way the wind was blowing. If the wind was blowing coming from the south, it would actually go between the mountains and the community. And anyway, at this hearing in down in Cananea, the issue came up about, gee, you have all these smelters that are coming online or enlarging in Mexico. Why don't you, what are you going to do about it? I mean, this is what Jim McNulty, who was at that time our representative, came up with. And the Mexican said, well, why should we worry about that? For the last 75 years, you've had Douglas dumping its debris upon us, and did you ever care about that? So we all sort of, whoa, apparently if we're going to get anything done, we better do something about Douglas. So then ironically, there was a fellow, Dick Camp, who now works for us, who was writing some little, had a little publication that he was sending out about the Douglas smelter and how detrimental it was. And so I was introduced to Dick, and we kind of got together and started talking about what can we do to try and bring the Douglas smelter under some kind of controls. And
at that time, the Douglas smelter was putting in a total, this one smelter, 15% of all the sulfur over North America. 15% of all the sulfur in the atmosphere over North America.
Well, and not only that, so there came a point where we went to New York City to visit the president of Phelps Dodge Corporation. And because we wanted to know kind of what are you planning to do. And so we sat down, and Dick was with me and myself, and I asked him directly. I said, "Do you have any plans on this?" And he said, "Well, no, we're not going to do anything." And you have to understand, in the 2 years, those 2 previous years, the Phelps Dodge Corporation had lost $68 and $75 million, but the Douglas smelter made them $15 million a year profit itself. So they certainly were not going to let that go. It had no controls, therefore it didn't have to clean up the air or anything like that. And so I said to him directly, I said, well, then I'm going to do everything I can to close you down or do what I can to stop that. Because I said it's a terrible detriment to our landscape and our countryside, and we'll never grow And I'm going to guarantee you we wouldn't have, because anyone coming in there would say, I'm not going to live there. I mean, the military might say you have to live there, but other than that, people would not want to go there. And so we went back, and the process of how this all changed, in a lot of ways, was in part a couple of things, 2 or 3 things happened. One thing we had an advantage was that Bruce Babbitt, who was really quite an environmentalist himself, was the governor of the state of Arizona. But we also put together, through Dick's direction and my help, and my brother is a participant in this, we put together a meeting before the governor, and we had about 12 people, I think at least, who had all different kinds of occupations, from Douglas, from Sierra Vista, and from the surrounding area. A rancher, a man who had a shoe store, we in the newspaper business, even a union person. There was even a union person who was there and said, look, they sat and gave to the governor their story of why this was a terrible detriment to our area. And I remember the lawyer who was representing us, who was also there, said to me, he says, I've never heard a meeting like this. He said, there's no way the governor can walk away from this meeting and not figure out he's going to try and do something about it. And fortunately, he did. But on top of that, we had a really unique resolution of this thing. The EPA basically says you cannot operate a business that is actually going to make people ill. And so what they did was they took a video camera, and they had a woman who lived in Sulphur Springs Valley, 10, 15 miles away from that smelter, and they put that video, and when that plume from the smelter dropped on that woman's house, every time it did, she was rushed to the hospital ill. And she was, legitimately. She has an asthmatic attack that made her extremely ill. And they had the plume coming down, they dated it and recorded it. The EPA came in and said, you can't do that. You cannot make people ill. You are going to have to close down. Well, of course, then the president of Phelps Dodge Corporation came back and said, well, can we do something about this? We don't want to. We said, we're sorry, it's too late now. We need to have clean air. And they closed it down, and it made it, basically, the cleanest air in southern Arizona for the last 75, 80 years. It had never been that clean. You know, and from the time that smelter came on. Yeah. The long-term consequences of even this was more significant, because as a result of that decision, number one, Nakazari had put filters on their plant and spent $50 million of government money to do that. Number two, Cananea did not enlarge. Phelps Dodge, Douglas smelter closed. And the U.S. government, Reagan, and Mexico made an agreement that for 100 miles on each side of that border, you cannot put a plant of a nature that will spew debris onto the other side of the country. So that it was a law that went into effect, a national law, international, between the two countries. So it had really a great deal of effect. I also want to say this, because when we got involved in this, I really did not think that it would come to fruition. I thought that, or if it did, it would take 20 or 30 years. I really did. That it would be a long, hard struggle, because Phelps Dodge, you know, was in a lot of ways had been the heart and soul of Arizona in the context of industry and production and stuff like that. So I thought, you know, fighting this big giant is going to take a long, hard haul. But things luckily fell into shape. And it was done with probably within 7 years, I think we were able to close it down. So I just say that you know, that was probably a lot of luck. We had the right people in the right place and the right circumstance. I will credit Dick Camp was brilliant in his observations about when to do what. He said, let's do this now, and let's do this now. But I also have to say that that I think a lot of people get upset and bothered by this, but I think the environmental movement, as a movement, in the latter half of the 20th century, is probably one of the most significant cultural movements in the world, because it is really, if you think about it, it has expanded now throughout the whole world. And I don't mean we were the first, it was starting before we were involved, but what I mean is I think that it's something that needed to be done, and you can certainly see now, both with McCain, and I don't get on too far in this, but with McCain and Obama, that they definitely feel that global warming is a reality and that we're going to have to do something about it so we can be conscious of our environment and really work with it so it does not have terrible effects on us long term. Excuse me for the matter.
Your feelings about the environment are also expressed in your art. For those who aren't familiar with your art, could you give them an idea of what you're thinking when you do your sculptures? What goes through your mind?
Well, I suspect, basically, my art is really I try to be a union of what I call man and nature. And really the plants that are on the sculpture are really a symbol of nature. And the sculpture itself is really a symbol of man, in a sense, or a symbol of myself, or man, let's put it that way, and the creation of those two. And it's trying to blend or put those two together, because I really feel that I don't want to get too elaborate, but we're one and the same. I mean, genetics between us and apes, or that is what, 95% almost the same. I mean, when you really, even biologically and genetically, the ties to all living things are really tight, really tight. And I think that the fact that we now know these things, we now realize our responsibility. I often would say that, let's see if I can get that right now. Well, I'm sorry, I apologize, maybe it'll pop in my head. But basically, that we have to understand this union, and we have to be constantly conscious of being a part of it, and that we are one. There is no separation. Anyway, excuse me.
Good answer. What are there other examples of newspaper leadership? We've got a room full of publishers here, each one leading their newspaper in their individual communities. Times when you've reached your proudest moments in your times with the company, examples of newspaper leadership or your proudest moments. The Douglas Smelter story, I can't imagine, Bob, that you could top that one, but are there other stories like that you could share with us?
Well, in an environmental sense, just to show you that even the good things go bad sometimes. Mount Graham, the development of the great telescope there, which is, whether you know it or not, is the largest telescope in the world, the most powerful telescope in the world. It is online now. It is two giant mirrors. And when they were developing that, I really was caught in the crooks, because I didn't know, is this a situation that we are just damaging the environment on Mount Graham, or is this a situation that's legitimate that we can put a telescope up there? And the environmental movement got very involved in opposing this. And I kept wondering what this was about, and I read every report and everything I could find about that. And I finally concluded that I didn't believe that that telescope would damage the top of Mount Graham. And the reason why is because there's basically 1,800 acres there that is set aside basically as a sanctuary. So that to protect basically for the placement of the telescopes, but also that no squirrel, the red squirrel was involved in this. No squirrel could be hunted in that area. Well, the complaint, was that, well, they're going to wipe out this subspecies of squirrel that was very unusual. And the fact of the matter is that that particular species of squirrel is thriving well today. And one of the original aspects of the top of Mount Graham, even for the Indians, was to view the stars. And so I thought this is a great historical thing, to put this giant telescope, which, by the way, in certain areas, particularly in the sub-millimeter area, it will have 10 times the power of Hubble in its ability to observe stars and the outer space. So I felt like after reading a lot of reports and stuff like that, I had to support it. And I got into a lot of hassles with some of the environmentalists. Now I'm going the other way. But I challenged them, and I even one of the man who's the most adamant of all, Ron Silver, I think it is, who has the, I said, I will put up $10,000, and I said, at the end of 10 years, I said, and that telescope is up there, I'll guarantee you there'll be as many squirrels as there are today. He would never take the bet. And I figured that, I believe that, and it is. The squirrels are thriving extremely well. And I guess I can do that because I also happen to have a strong belief in, astrophysics and the power of astronomy, and that's one of the great clean sciences of the world. So anyway.
Walt, proud moments in newspaper history?
Well, I can think of a couple. I don't think that they approach some of the satisfactions that we got from Bob's environmental work particularly. But I remember one time in Williston, why the Red Cross came to me and said, we're in danger of losing the bloodmobile. It won't come here anymore because we never raise enough blood. And so I read an editorial, and I put the editorial on the front page, and it said, Williston says to hell with the bloodmobile. The next day I got all these letters from mostly pastors and stuff like this saying you should never use the word, quote, hell in a headline. You're making arrangements to provide a poor example for our children and so forth. But the amazing thing was that when the bloodmobile came, it set a record for the entire district and it came out of Minneapolis here. It set a record for the number of pints of blood given in one day. And it was so great that they had to ship out another refrigerator car all the way to Williston to pick up the amount of blood that they had planned to take in. And I'd be willing to bet that record stands today. And for a long time after that, or at least as long as I was there, the bloodmobile always hit its quota. And I was really proud of that editorial. On another occasion, this was back when I lived in Ohio and was running, I was managing editor of the Niles Times. And we had a city health director who was a pain in the ass, is the only way I can describe him. And I don't think he died in grace, I'll be honest with you. But anyway, this was the time when Jonas Salk came up with the polio vaccine. And of course, in my town in Ohio, I knew several kids that had suffered and limped because of polio. And the health director before that, old fellow by the name of Dr. Basil, who was an amazing gentleman, had died, and they had appointed this doctor. I guess he was a doctor, but anyway, he would not make arrangements, as Dr. Basil always did, to give tetanus shots and measles shots and all those shots free to every school student in our school system. And they were purchased by the city, and they were made sure that all these kids had these shots. There wasn't a question of whether the parents paid for them or anything. This town paid for them. Pardon me, I get kind of emotional at times. And I got so bad. The city nurse, gave me information that told me what the score was on this guy. And so I went out and I knocked on corporate doors. And at that time, I got $100 from 10 different persons connected with the city, industrialists. And that doesn't sound like much. That was back in 53. I got that. It cost us $1,000. Well, that just paid for the inoculations of the polio vaccine. The vaccine was free from the state of Ohio. And that's what a son of a gun that doctor was. But he was forced to give them. And the mayor and the school system forced him to give those shots, and they couldn't say that they didn't have the money to do it. So I want you to know that the newspaper made arrangements for every kid in town to get a polio shot. Yeah.
Great.
But I want to just mention, you know, Jim, my Uncle Jim was a wonderful guy. And he never had any kids. Like I say, it was kind of like this example of the absent-minded professor. He never drove a car after 1936, because while driving down Pearl Street one day in Niles, Ohio, he ran into the porch of a neighbor, and as a result, he gave up driving. He was trying to read a newspaper at the same time. And, but Jim, as a young boy, had a crossed eye. He had been born with a crossed eye, and most people don't know that at that time, that he just later on in his life, I'm talking about in his teens, actually had an operation that straightened that eye out, and so he turned to books, and he was a terrific intellectual who later from his particular class, I don't know, mentioned that from the University of Minnesota, he debated with Stassen, where it was his debate department, who was governor of Minnesota, and Dirksen, who later became the senator and majority leader of the Senate when the Republicans held the majority in about 53 or 55, and Wayne Morris, who was one of the great intellectuals of the Senate from Montana. And they were all classmates and all debate partners in the various things that they did from the University of Minnesota. And but he was one of these fellows who went to the city of London when it was in the Blitz, and he was there during the same time that Robert R. Murrah was there, reporting on the stuff that went on. There's some people in every town. There are also people who are truly noble individuals. And forgive me for this, but it's very emotional. Sonny Jim Jennings was so angry with the newspaper for opposing their operations that he decided he was going to go around and visit every merchant in town and tell them that the element that he controlled and the money he controlled and the district in town, which he could always get 900 votes out of 1,000 possible votes cast in order to elect his man. He tried to he went to every merchant and he said, this is what's going to happen to your business if you do not go along with me and oppose the Niles Times and the people who run it and take away from your advertising. And there was a wonderful gentleman, merchant in town by the name of David Rubenstein, a Jewish merchant who said, Milt, we're not going to let those bastards get away with that, are we? And he said, come on. And he took my dad by the arm, and they went to every business in Niles. And they followed the steps of Sonny Jim Jennings, and they told what a son of a gun he was. And did they want a racketeer running their town? And they all said no. And Sonny Jim went back to his home and closed the door on the situation and never again tried to influence the people of the city to take his side against the side of the merchants and of the Niles Times. And I still think what a great man that David Rubenstein was to this day. And we need someone like him in every town, whether it's a newspaper man or whether it's a merchant, when those type of circumstances occur. So I want you to know about that type of thing. I'll tell you something about my dad. When I went, this is, you asked in one of those questions about what was your dad like as a person and what his core belief was. I'm never sure about what his core belief was. You have to understand that he was the son of a Lutheran minister and a rancher and a lawyer. My grandfather, Milton Wick, homesteaded out in eastern South Dakota and ran custom combining operations from the Canadian border all the way to Oklahoma on horses that he raised on the lands that he homesteaded, and which we own some even to just 10 or 20 years ago. We still owned small portions of the lands that he had homesteaded up around Pierre, South Dakota. It was called Bowdle, South Dakota, northeast of Pierre. But my grandfather, who had read for the law in South Dakota, stood for election. He could speak German and Norwegian and English, so he acted for a lot of farmers, and he ran for prosecuting attorney because he was a lawyer in the eastern county in South Dakota, and was elected prosecuting attorney. And he held the job for 6 months, and he went to his wife and he said, "Louisa, I cannot be a Christian gentleman and a prosecuting attorney at the same time," and resigned. So that's the background that my father and my uncle came out of. Prairie preachers, essentially. My uncle lived all his life in Guatemala, most of his life in Guatemala as a missionary for the Presbyterian Church, and his primary deal down in Guatemala was building schools for the Indians. So you come from that kind of background. And I remember when I came home from college one time, I was walking down the street with my father in Niles, Ohio, and a little man who was maybe 60 at the time passed us came up to the street, and Dad said, "Hello, Patty," and Patty looked up at my dad, and he spit at his feet and walked on. And I was so upset, I was going to turn around and grab him and ask him what the hell that was all about. And Dad grabbed me and said, "No, Walt." He said, "You have to understand." He said, "At one time, some 20 years ago, Patty Fusco, who was a lawyer in town, got involved with his secretary. And it was a sad story on both sides, but it became a legal problem. And we, as a newspaper at that time, and what we were publishing and all this stuff in the newspaper, we ended up having to publish the details of this conflict between his secretary and himself." And he said, "Patty has never forgiven us." I said, "Well, why do you even bother saying hello to him?" He said, "Well, Walt, I'm always hoping that someday when I say, 'Hi, Patty,' he'll turn around and say, 'Hi, Milt.'" And forgive me for watering so extensively. And I hope it'll help the environment. But anyway, you want to know a little bit about what these people were like.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think we may have time for one or two questions from the audience, and if that's all right.
Go ahead.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Bob, before we do that?
Well, I was going to tell a few more stories, but
right.
Whatever you want to do.
Well,
about Uncle Jim.
The tape machines are going to run dry here, and I got a feeling, so we have a finite amount of time.
Well,
go ahead and
I think this is an interesting facet, and probably explores both an aspect of my uncle and my father. Number one, my uncle was really he had a tremendous imagination, and he could just constantly try out new things. Well, whether you do or not know it, he owned Human Events, which was a very powerful conservative Washington newsletter at the time. But in about 1950, he decided. Now you have to understand, this is almost the height of the Cold War. He decided he was going to he was going to try to take some publishers from Middle America into Russia. And of course, Russia was a closed world. Stalin was in charge.
Iron Curtain.
Iron Curtain. Real Iron Curtain. And so he made a request. He actually made a request to bring 10 publishers in. And I think Coles was one of them, who ran the Tribune here at one time, was one of them. But anyway, he got turned down that first time. So I thought, well, since I at least even got turned down, I think I'm going to send a telegram to Stalin. So he did. He sent a telegram to Stalin, and he said, since we cannot bring publishers in, could you answer a few questions for us? And so, believe it or not, he got a reply. And one of the questions he asked was, would there be a Cold War? Would there be a war? Would this Cold War heat up? And Stalin's reply was, no, it would not. And anyway, that particular telegram, Uncle Jim, is then pictured on the front page of the New York Times with that telegram. So that was 50, and I believe, if I'm correct, Stalin died in 51.
53.
Was it 53? Okay, 53. So shortly after that, anyway, my uncle my uncle made another request, and this time he got permission to bring 10 publishers in. Well, Salisbury, who was the writer, columnist for the New York Times, was the only person who really had any ability to go into Russia from the Western world, pretty much, and write about and stuff like that. And Uncle Jim's idea was, and he tried to kind of portray this, was, well, you know, this great society you have built, well, the heartland of America is, you know, these publishers coming from the Midwest, and they can talk about the great accomplishments of your communist state. That's the way to do it. So anyway, they did go in, and they started doing that. Well, my mom and dad did not go on the first trip, but they went on the second trip, and they actually, they went 3 or 4 times at least into Russia, including going through Eastern Europe also, and visiting the heads of state, including Marshal Tito, the King of Belgium, Anthony Eden, of course, in London, and that, and I have some wonderful photographs and stuff like that of that. I just want to mention a couple of aspects of that, and I'll tell 2 stories. I'll try and keep this real brief. Number 1, which actually my brother told me yesterday, that my Uncle Jim, there was a point where Uncle Jim took a photograph of a Jeep that was in front of, and he didn't pay attention to what was behind it. It was actually a police station behind it. And he was, of course, arrested by the police at the time, because you weren't supposed to, you know, take any photographs of any police contingent or anything like that. And so they arrested him, and they took him into the police station. And of course, my uncle, my dad and mom, I think, were with him at the time. And while they're waiting there, Uncle Jim is getting quite fidgety. And my dad thought, gee, he seems awfully nervous here, you know, and he kept getting and he even blurts out, well, do what you want to do. Just let us go back to the hotel. And my dad thought, gee, that's sort of a strange response. Well, ultimately, he was given the okay. And they went back to the hotel, and my dad said to my Uncle Jim, gee, Dad, Uncle Jim, he said, Jim, I don't understand. You seemed almost like you're fearful, like they were going to arrest you or permanently or something like that. I said, no. He said, I just had a terrible case of diarrhea, and I had to get to the bathroom. But another story, which I will elaborate about my father, and I think this also portrays the courage, the character of my father. Lanya Hodakov was the director of in-tours for them, and actually toured around with them. That was his name. And he eventually became head of all of in-tourist, which the all guides or groups that would come into Russia. And there was a kind of an irritation. He would be a very irritating fellow, because he obviously, we were capitalists from an outside world, and he wanted to push his pins in whenever he could. So one day, they're coming back to the hotel, and he stopped about a mile short of the hotel, and they say, Lanya Hodakov gets out. And you remember, this is Russia in the spring, very extremely cold. And my father had had a heart attack some years before. His circulation was pretty lousy. And anyway, Lanya Hodakov gets out and said, we're going to walk to the hotel from here. And my father says, I can't do that. He says, well, it doesn't make any difference, you're going to have to. My mother was with him in the back seat of the cab. They were actually in kind of a cab at the time. And my dad said, I can't do it. Well, Lanya Hodakov says, you have to. Doesn't make any difference. And he's now getting out of the car, and he's standing outside the car, telling him, get out. My father says, I'm not going to do it. And my mother says, I'm with my husband. Finally, my father says, cabby, he says, and he grabs the door and slams. He said, take us to the hotel. The cabbie drove off to the hotel and left Lanya Hodakov standing by the street. Anyway, I think that shows the kind of character my father could be. He was not a fearful man. Anyway.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Great story. We can take one question, maybe 2 from the audience. Anybody have something? I think Steve Woody had a question, maybe. I don't know. No? All right. No? All right. Go ahead, Kevin. If you can get a microphone over to Kevin.
During the Depression years, did your dad and Uncle Jim, they have many papers, and how did they do during that time, just managing?
Well, they actually had quite a number of small weeklies connected with the Niles Times that they had either purchased or created in the small towns in the suburbs of Youngstown, which is a big industrial town there halfway between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and the Niles-Warren area. Many of them died out during the Depression, simply because they were not being supported. They couldn't be. It was also the fact that they had to lose so many employees at that time that they didn't have the manpower to do what they had been doing before. They had another daily even in Pennsylvania but it was in competition with the long-established daily there too, so they had to give that one up. But like I say, they made it through the Depression, and then of course my Uncle Jim was living in New York at the time, working for Prentice Hall, as well as reporting for the newspaper in certain aspects, like when he went to the Blitz and during the war. So many men went to the war, you know, that the women were practically running the newspaper in that sense, and they did a wonderful job. I can still name them, you know, Bessie Biddle and Agnes Lopata and just a number of women who really just took over as editorial in the editorial positions and wherever else, advertising and so forth, and who stayed with us, many of them, until they finally retired back in the 60s and 70s. It was a real rough period. It was a rough period for everyone. And I don't think many people here, maybe some of you have grandfathers or parents who lived through the Depression and know what they went through. Yeah.
Very good. I think there's a need for part 2 and part 3 of this, but for now we've run out of time, and certainly appreciate your time with us and your answers. Thank you very much. Good job, Bob. Thank you.